The 1960 Chinese first ascent of Mount Everest's north face stands as one of the most controversial claims in mountaineering history. With no irrefutable proof, the story has divided climbers for decades. And today we have with us Jochen Hemmleb, who is considered the world's foremost authority on Mount Everest, who has written extensively on this expedition and himself has interviewed all of the summit climbers from the 1960 Everest expedition on 2 occasions. No one is more qualified to make the call on whether they made it or not than Jochen. Could the ascent have taken place under such difficult conditions? After today's video, you'll be far better prepared to make that decision. This is the second video on the 1960 Chinese expedition. After last week's video was released, there was a lot of doubt and skepticism. Ironically, Jochen and I had a Zoom call scheduled for today. I asked him innocuously about that skepticism, and he said, "Tom, hit the record button." And that's what I have for you today. You do not want to miss it. So let's get to that interview with Jochen Hemmleb, who addresses all the key points of the ascent. Here's my interview with Jochen Hemmleb from his home in Italy. I found it really interesting, Jochen, actually, though, that so many people were adamant, like saying there's no way in 100 years that they could have made it. And then they're similarly are the ones who give Mallory and Irvin a better than, even chance of having made it. And I find that interesting. And what they use partially as their argument is there's no way somebody could have climbed in their socks or that they could have gone without water for 30 hours. And that doesn't really mean anything, to me. So, or they refused letting people observe the summit rocks and do a test on it. I just find it interesting and curious what your thoughts are on that.
There are probably technical reasons people cite, or there are political reasons. And as far as the political reasons go, the Chinese certainly had the disadvantage in 1960 that their reports were so riddled with propaganda that a lot of the topographical detail got lost, but it is still remarkable that the description of the last 300 feet or something like that, or 500 feet from the top of the 3rd step to the summit, even the first reports featured terrain descriptions that are remarkably consistent with the reports of more recent expeditions and later expeditions. I mean, they describe the summit snowfield, and they described that they couldn't get up to the very tip of the snowfield, but they had to traverse around that summit tower. And when they got back onto the summit ridge, they first thought that the first rise in the ridge was the actual summit. And so they were already kind of celebrating. And when they got up there, they said, oh my God, the summit is another 100 meters on along that summit ridge. And this is exactly the same impression that Eric Simonson reported from 91. He told me, well, we went up that first rise in the ridge and thought we had made it. And then we realized, hey, it's another 100 meters to go to the summit. And also Matt Dickinson reporting absolutely the same experience. So, yeah, if you can put it this way, from the photographical evidence, the Chinese got to the base of the 3rd step. I mean, that's beyond any doubt. When you look at the footage from 1960 and you look at the 2 panorama shots, it is clear that the one shot that shows the summit ridge, the summit triangle, that this is from the base of the 3rd step. So there's no doubt about that. And after that, you can only say, well, there is the match between the verbal descriptions they provided, and that's all. When you come to the technical points, what people don't realize is that there was so little difference in terms of the equipment used by the Chinese and the equipment used by the Americans in 3 years later, in 1963. Because what the Chinese did was they took 2 Russian cargo planes to Europe, I think in 59, and they went shopping in Europe. They went to Germany, to France, to Switzerland, and they bought their equipment there. They had mostly, I think, French down clothing, and they had German and French oxygen equipment. And they reported similar problems as the Americans did in 63, with essentially the same type of oxygen system. Because high on the mountain, the famous images of Tom Hornbein having the big yellow bottles. Well, the Chinese had the same, only that the Chinese were gray or blue. And it was the same type. It was the French oxygen bottle reinforced with piano wire, a standard oxygen bottle in the 1960s and 70s. And they had the same regulator systems and the same oxygen masks. So in terms of equipment, they were fairly well equipped, like the Americans were in 1963. And when you go to the American experiences, well, if Hornbein, Unsold, and Bishop and Jedstedt could survive a bivvy on the balcony, it's not too far a stretch that Liu Li and Man could have survived a bivvy above the second step. So that's 100-meter difference, or 150 meters. But he did. What's also interesting to point out is, I bet you that most of the doubters, or maybe nearly all the doubters that are now circulating on the web, none of these have ever spoken to the Chinese. And I was privileged to interview the summit team from 1960, except for the Tibetan. I didn't have the chance to interview Gonbu. Ironically, he's the last of the summit team who is still alive, but he is unfortunately in poor health now and has difficulties receiving visitors. But yeah, I interviewed Wang Fuchao, I interviewed Chu Yinhua, the one who took off his boots and climbed the second step. I talked to Liu Li and Man, who gave up above the second step and bivvied near the third step. And I interviewed Chu Jing, who probably saw the body of Irwin high on the northeast ridge, but more importantly in this context, was scheduled originally to be in the summit team. But when he left the camp in the morning, he was sick from altitude, and he gave up after 30 meters at the first step. And Chu Yinhua, he originally only wanted to stay at the high camp, at Camp 7. They had 2 high camps in 1960. They had the high camp for the summit team, which was in a notch at the very start of the first step. And a little bit further down the ridge, they had another Camp 7, and that was from the support team. They had a couple of climbers supporting the summit team, and the leader of that support group was Chu Yinhua, and he was assigned to film the summit climb from that high camp. And when he saw Chu Jing turning back at the first step, it was decided that he should join the summit team instead. So he took his camera with him and he went on the summit climb with the rest of the team. So I talked to him. I saw his terribly frostbitten feet. All the toes missing, part of the heel missing, and the scars on the tissue, they were breaking open again. He was in a lot of pain in his last years, and that was pretty grim. And yeah, so all the crucial members of the summit team, I had the privilege to interview in 2001 and 2008. And I have to say, of all the people I met, the interview I did with Liu Lianman, the one who bivvied above the second step, was the most touching, really, because initially when we talked to him, he was giving us the standard party line. I mean, everything that's in the book and being warmed by the thoughts of Mao and so on. He told us the same story all over again. But when it came to the part of the summit climb and it came to the description of his bivvy and then being reunited, I mean, he wasn't, when he settled down for that bivvy, he said he wasn't certain that he would survive this and that he would ever return to base camp. And that was when he turned off his oxygen, because he said, my colleagues who go to the summit, they could need it. And so he saved his oxygen for his partners. And when he realized that he was going to survive and then saw his 3 partners coming down and rejoining him, when he told us this in the interview, he broke down. He really started to cry, and he cried for several minutes. And when I watched this, I really got the feeling he really experienced what he told us he experienced. And that kind of emotional reaction from him told me more than any photo and film analysis or whatsoever. And I came away, because I got such personal impression, not only from him but from the others as well, that they really did what they said they did, and that a lot of the official reports had ignored this personal experience in order to create this sort of party line. But once you saw the personal reaction, how they were affected by the events and how vividly they could recall them nearly 50 years on, that was very, very convincing. And it gave the whole story a human element. And it told me that their expedition in 1960 was not so different from other Western Himalayan expeditions, which had their fair share of tragedies and close calls. And the Chinese really were on their last legs on that 1960 climb, and they barely made it down from the mountain.
If you're enjoying this video, I hope you'll take a moment to subscribe and to click the bell icon so you're notified every time a new video comes out. And also consider becoming a member so you can get access to exclusive content throughout the channel. Now back to my interview with Jochen Hemmleb.
I can only say to those who doubt the Chinese that unless you really have spoken to the participant, I don't think that your arguments are that solid. And especially when you consider that in terms of equipment, the Chinese were not so much different from the Americans in '63. And even more important, the Chinese had considerable high altitude experience at the time. They did those training climbs in the Pamirs with the Soviets, and they climbed several 7,000 meters peaks. They had high altitude experience, and they had the stamina. They had a very strong training regime, and this is all something that needs to be considered in evaluating the Chinese climb. And when it comes down to evidence, it is, as I said before, there is evidence that they made it to the top of the second step, to the base of the third step. Beyond that, there is no firm evidence, but you could easily give them the benefit of the doubt.
Amazing.
And you have statements from people like Chris Bonington, who became fairly convinced after he had met with some of the Chinese members from 1960. And he did so a lot earlier than I did. I mean, he did this in the early 80s. And you have statements from Stephen Venables who said, well, it's not that impossible to climb without gloves on Everest for a short time if the conditions are fairly benign. So yeah, I mean, what Chu Yinhua did, it was not. This became exaggerated in the course of time. I mean, they were talking about that he climbed barefoot. No, he did not. I mean, he still had a pair of socks on in order not to hurt his partner. And then when he got to the top of the second step, they tied his boots to the rope and he pulled his boots up. But it was too late. I mean, he had his feet frostbitten, but he was able to continue.
Jochen, so the climbing of the second step. So Simonson, Eric, was there with you on one or both of those interview trips that you did, right? And
on the first in 2001, yeah.
And he, to me, like, because since he was there at the second step and used the ladder that was there, he was fairly convinced. I figure if Simonson is convinced, because there's a guy who's not, I say this in a complimentary way, he's not easily moved by emotion. He's a very, fast guy, runs an expedition like a hard guy kind of. And I mean this on the benefit of the doubt. If Simonson says it, like, boom, so my gut is that was convincing to him as well.
Yeah, and I mean, we got when we were in Beijing in 2001, we had the picture of the second step, we had the picture of the head wall, and we had Chu Yinhua describing us exactly where he went. And he pointed out to us where he placed his first piton and that it took him ages to place the second piton because they only had very long multi-purpose pitons that could serve as rock pitons and ice pitons at the same time. They were French pitons about this long. And interestingly enough, we found some of those pitons in that old tent we found on the East Rongbuk in 99. You remember the tent?
Yeah.
And he found at the base of the North Col, and there were two of those pitons. When I was with the Chinese in Beijing, and Chu Yinhua told us, well, we only had those long ice pitons, and it took me ages. I think he said 40 minutes to get that second piton in. I drew a sketch of that piton. It has this characteristic elongated eye. And I drew a sketch and showed it to him, and he said, "Yes, yeah, that's the piton." And
incredible.
So the Chinese ladder that was used until the mid 2000s, the original ladder that was tied to the old 1960s pitons. And I mean, when Conrad finally...
I did not know that. So they used pitons that were in the second step to affix that ladder in 75?
Yeah, and
amazing.
Several 1975 climbers are now on record saying, yeah, we still found the rope on the second step from the 1960 team, the rope they had used to rappel the second step. Some of the 1975 climbers are on record saying this, that they found the old equipment from 1960 at the second step, and they also used it. Yeah.
So that's absolutely incredible, because I did not know that. But I've also seen some of the skeptics saying the Chinese have refused to let people examine the summit rocks from 1960. And I was like, somebody actually requested that? And how could they get it out of the Chinese embassy? Or I don't know.
The problem is also there is probably very little difference, if any difference at all, between rocks from the summit and rocks from, say, the third step. I think it's all the same type of rocks above the second step and to the summit. And so testing the summit rocks would be, not be a very convincing result.
The balance of my interview with Jochen will be on my podcast, The Happiness Quotient. I'll put the link to that interview in the description of this video. He goes on to talk about how important the records of the 1920s British expeditions, as well as the 1933 British expedition, was for the 1960 Chinese Everest expedition, going so far as to follow their route identically to the ridge. If you haven't done so already, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon. Do a good deed, don't ask for anything in return. Make the world a better place, one tiny step at a time. Peace be with you.